Good day, Brisbane.
Good day.
I'm Martin Lamb, and here are my colleagues
Richard Smith
and Harry Kucher.
And we're here to present a part of the symposium on learner autonomy with a specific focus on learner autonomy in developing countries. So my first encounter with the field of learner autonomy was via the debate over whether it was a relevant concept in developing world contexts. And specifically, it was the well-known and very stimulating article by Jeremy Jones in ELT Journal in 1995, based on his experiences setting up a self-access centre at a Cambodian university, in which he questioned whether individual learner autonomy was an appropriate educational goal at that time in Phnom Penh University. And this resonated with me because when I read the article, I was also trying to set up a self-access centre in an Indonesian university. And while the process of getting books and CD players and other materials in place was relatively easy, the challenge of getting any students in the room was proving almost impossible. Was it because our materials were not attractive to them, or were the learners culturally averse to the model of independent, individualised study which we were offering? It was all the more puzzling because I had no doubt at all that the most successful learners of English in that context, in Indonesia, provincial Indonesia, had succeeded in learning English outside the classroom through their own endeavours. It was as if there was learner autonomy everywhere, in fact, except in formal educational contexts. I concluded that learner autonomy mattered more there because official provision of English was so restricted and restrictive. A motivated learner simply couldn't rely on what their school was offering them. Of course, debates about learner autonomy and culture have moved on since then, as have our understanding of language learning beyond the classroom. It's also true that formal language education contexts in parts of Indonesia have changed dramatically in the last 15 years, and there's a lot more language learning actually taking place in school classrooms now than there used to be. Nevertheless, I continue to believe that the concept of learner autonomy has a particular kind of relevance in the developing world, because there is still a dissonance between what formal education offers or can offer and what many learners want. For example, in the rural parts of Indonesia, globalization and its technologies are having the effect of increasing the desire for English among young people and providing novel means of accessing it, while their school English lessons remain largely unchanged, dependent on textbooks, assessments, and the professionalism of their teacher. I would go so far as to suggest that this dissonance is found in most developing world contexts right now, and how it affects learners' feelings of autonomy and their autonomous learning and use of English is worthy of study. I'll now hand over to Harry, who will give his own perspective.
Well, I first heard about the concept of learner autonomy during my MA studies at the University of Warwick, and I think that was in 2006. Coming with 10 years of experience as a teacher in my country, Cameroon, I was quite keen to learn about new and better ways of addressing the challenges of my teaching context. And discussions on learner autonomy resonated immediately with my own practices and made me realize that there may be potential for developing innovative and contextually appropriate forms of pedagogy in the actual spontaneous and pragmatic responses to classroom realities of teachers in such contexts as mine in sub-Saharan Africa. And I've gone ahead to develop that in my PhD research, which I'll talk about much later. Exploring the literature further, literature on learner autonomy, I found that most of the discussions focused on the debate about the cultural appropriateness or inappropriateness of learner autonomy in non-Western contexts. And central to these discussions was the idea that self-access centers and access to technology were useful ways of developing learner independence and autonomy. Speaking from an African context, I found Remy Sonaya's work in 2002, which, by the way, was the only available research publication from Africa on the subject, I found her article arguing that learner autonomy might not be effective for Yoruba learners, a people for whom, she says, participation in a communal setting is of great value because it seemed to undermine the communal aspects of learning. Now, looking back at my own experience, I thought it was this communal aspect of learning that enabled me and my students to develop autonomous learning as a rescue solution to the challenges we face. And these challenges included very large classes of more than 200 teenagers in a very tiny classrooms in temperatures above 46 degrees Celsius, and with almost no textbooks to rely on. The process through which, with the help of my students, we were able to develop a pedagogy of autonomy has been described in an article that I published with Richard in 2011. And the result was that students were able to develop their own learning materials, as well as ideas about pedagogic practices that will enable them and their peers attain learning objectives that were both relevant to them and consistent with syllabus requirements. So I think in developing world contexts like sub-Saharan Africa, where I come from, socioeconomic factors affect education considerably, and therefore learners tend to rely on their innate propensity to explore knowledge about what is available to or even remote from them, and sometimes this is done in spite of the teacher. I also think that while developments in technology clearly have the potential to reduce some of the challenges, such as large classes, there is still some need to develop autonomy-related practices which take into consideration the social dynamics of traditional classrooms, given that at the moment, at least at the moment, these different forms of technology are still a long way from being available and affordable to many students in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, I'd like to go back a little bit to what Martin was saying about his development of his interest in the 90s. This is also when I became involved with learner autonomy, and there was this big debate about the cultural appropriateness of learner autonomy. I think it was framed very much in the Western versus Eastern notions of culture. And there was a little bit on developing countries, but it wasn't, it seemed to me, framed in north-south terms. When I came to publish the book Learner Autonomy Across Cultures with David Palfreyman, we did have a chapter by somebody called Gamini Fonseca. This was in Sri Lanka, but it has to be said that the literature on autonomy in developing countries is still very sparse, despite the fact that the majority of English language teaching and learning goes on in developing countries. This is a gap I think we are trying to say needs to be filled in this input. Well, Gamini Fonseca talked about his practice in Sri Lanka, in a Sri Lankan village, teaching children who had no textbooks and very few resources. And his idea was to get students memorizing songs and rhymes and carrying those rhymes and songs around in their heads and working with that in his classes. He called it a rescue strategy to the difficult circumstances the children were facing, and what he meant by that, a lack of resources, among other things. I came back to this through my teaching in the UK, teaching students teachers who were coming from developing countries, and I think I came back to this with a different perspective. The perspective by now, and this continues for me, was how can teachers from what we might call difficult circumstances, by which I mean low resourced classrooms, lack of textbooks, great heat, large classes, how can they be helped to teach appropriately, and not necessarily from the perspective of pedagogy for autonomy at all. But it did seem to me, from the case of Gamini Fonseca and Harry's case, for example, and others I came across, like Zakia Sarwar in Pakistan, they were discovering, as it were, a pedagogy of autonomy as a kind of rescue solution to these situations. So this comes back to what Martin was saying. in a slightly different sense, that autonomy, and I'm talking about pedagogy of autonomy, can be an eminently appropriate concept that we can work with for such circumstances. So rather than autonomy being seen as something which is constrained by such circumstances, pedagogy of autonomy is eminently appropriate approach in such circumstances.
So we're now going to just suggest a few specific issues which we think might be worth exploring, starting first by looking at what learners in developing countries are doing to learn language autonomously, and then looking at the way how teachers might be involved in that. Technology, mobile technology in particular, has potentially a very important role to play in fostering learner autonomy, I think. And this was brought to the attention of the ELT world in Britain very recently by Sugata Mitra. I urge you to have a look at his plenary talk at IATEFL, which is online, available online. And this is where he talked about his famous hole-in-the-wall experiments, where he claimed to have enabled children to learn how to use computers without any scaffolding from adults. And this talk provoked a storm of protest in the ELT community, because people believed it was undermining the role of teachers. But I've seen myself in rural Indonesia, in quite remote parts of Sumatra, young people using relatively cheap mobile phones to learn English. Or rather, they were using their English resources to use their smartphones and connect to the world. And in the process, they were expanding those resources. How widespread is this phenomenon? Is it only where mobile technology is particularly cheap that this is possible? What are young people actually doing on their phones with English? And is it only those individuals from better off homes that are using mobile phones in this way? And is it individual or a group phenomenon? That's just one issue that I believe is worth exploring.
Right. My recent research has been with younger learners and between the ages of 11 and 12 in very low resource large class contexts where there is no talk of technology, by the way, and where even textbooks are very rare to come by. And as part of a broader study for my PhD, I wanted to find out from these children what they thought were good English language teaching practices. So I used various participatory approaches recommended in the literature and that were quite child-friendly and familiar to the children to elicit ideas about a good practice. Now, lots of things emerged from what the children said, but amongst the good practices that they identified, now children, for example, wanted their teachers, they wanted teaching that encouraged them to work in groups or in pairs to develop their own ideas. They did not like teachers who explained every detail to them. They wanted to be challenged to think for themselves. These were 11-year-old children. I also found in some of the things the children said an indication that they wanted to be more involved in developing the materials that teachers used in the classroom. So I think there are indications that from research like this that we need to listen to children's voices and that there's potential even in listening to children's voices to see that there are indications that we need that learner autonomy could be developed from a learner's perspective as well.
I'd just like to bring it back to the issue of why are we doing the research, and picking up on the issue of who does the research, which Harry has raised here. For me, with my own interest in teacher development, it's ideal to get the teachers involved in doing the research, and picking up on what Harry has been saying, it's ideal to have research with children. This is what Harry's research has been, research with children, not on children as an outsider. So it seems that the teacher's role should be quite central in the research that we want to do into autonomy in developing countries. At least that's from my perspective, my own motivation for my interest, which is teacher development.
A central issue is the role of the teacher then in fostering learner autonomy in developing country contexts. Do learners become autonomous in spite of their teacher, or sometimes even to spite their teacher? Does it matter whether the teacher actually does try to foster learner autonomy deliberately, or whether learner autonomy is a kind of byproduct of the limitations of, or the restrictions of school language education? And the answers to these questions will almost certainly vary from context to context. And I came on this issue quite unexpectedly, actually, when carrying out research into inspiring English teachers with my colleague Martin Waddell. And we sought out, through learners, we asked learners in China and in Indonesia to nominate inspiring teachers of English that they'd had in their state schools. And we eventually identified 4 teachers in Guangzhou, China, and 4 in Jakarta, Indonesia, who had been nominated by many learners as being inspiring, and we went to visit them in their schools and talk to them and watch them teach. And I was amazed to find that the 3 out of the 4 teachers in Jakarta were very deliberately promoting learner autonomy in their classrooms, quite unlike, I should add, the teachers in China, who were brilliant teachers but in other ways. And it turned out, though, that these 3 teachers in Jakarta had all had actually extensive contact with Anglophone education systems. So 2 of them had studied for a short time in America, and 1 had worked at a British private language school in Jakarta. So although what they were doing seemed to serve their purposes very well and to suit their learners very well, it wasn't actually an indigenous pedagogy. The teachers were self-consciously importing ideas from outside Indonesia, and they admitted that actually few of their colleagues taught in this way.
In the context of an interest in developing appropriate pedagogy for low-resource classrooms or difficult circumstances, I think absolutely what we need is more descriptions of practice successful practice as defined locally. And because I talked earlier about the lack of literature on autonomy in developing countries, but there's also, that's in the context of a lack of literature on teaching in developing countries, in low-resource classrooms in developing countries generally. So from this broader interest of teaching appropriately in developing country context, in low-resource classrooms or large classes, we have begun to collect stories, cases of success in these circumstances, and this can be in the context of teacher development, and it has been in my own experience. And some of these stories that are shared do seem to show characteristics of pedagogy of autonomy, and this is what we wrote about with Harry, but it's also, in my experience, in collecting more stories together with Harry, partly, and we're calling this an enhancement approach, and this is Harry's phrase for it, which I think is a very good phrase. We want to base suggestions for appropriate pedagogy on cases of success as locally defined, as opposed to importing ideas from outside, which has been the case in the past, and that could be from the West, from the North, whatever. And so a bottom-up approach to developing appropriate pedagogy, it may or may not involve notions of engaging with and developing autonomy, but in some cases, at least, it certainly has done, in my experience. So I think what we need to do is develop more stories, and Martin's research with Martin Waddell is also looking at inspiring teachers. I think it's very much in the same sort of enhancement paradigm, if you like. Mm-hmm. So that's my vision for the future research, that we develop more descriptions of cases of successful practice, which we may theorise then in relation to autonomy.
Yeah, and in addition to that, my own experience of teacher development, and recently my research has shown that teachers might benefit from more kind of exploratory research that takes on board perspectives of their learners and their own ideas about what other colleagues are doing.
So we'd love to be there with you in Brisbane to discuss these, to hear your reactions to what we've said, but our own difficult circumstances mean that we can't be there. But I'm sure that Noko and Alice will feed back to us your reactions, and we hope you enjoy the conference, the rest of the conference very much. So it's bye from all of us.